In this video, we're going to take a look at exploring some of the tools that we've learned in the Fusion 360 Forms Mastering series to create some geometry. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, I want to take a look at applying some of the things that we've learned throughout the series so far. Now, one of the things that we haven't really done is we haven't really tried to make geometry that has harder edges on it. And this is a technique that is actually pretty hard to do. And what we want to do is we want to take a look at the design that's in the description of the video. It's a starting point for a BMW M2 competition bumper. Now, when I say starting point, I don't really have any intention on finishing this bumper or this car. So before we get started, just know that this is an exercise in practicing some of these techniques and possibly exploring some new ones. So in the design that you downloaded, you can see that there is some geometry that replicates or represents the BMW M2 competition's bumper. There's also a couple canvases here, so we can see this bumper from the front and from the side. Also, in the description of the video, there is a link to the BMW website where you can find lots of images of this car. Now, the intent here is not to exactly replicate the car or, again, to completely create the bumper, but I thought it was important for us to try to explore and understand ways in which we can try to create some of this harder geometry using forms and learn about some ways in which we can work with, manipulate, and potentially fix some problems. Before we get started, I do want to note that there are really two main workflows that you can approach when you're doing something like this. The first workflow is similar to how we've modeled the Ferrari 308, as we start with a face and we begin building out from there. The other workflow is to create the larger general shape and then start changing the division lines for the form. You start adding more division lines, deleting or removing some areas, and then you can begin to work with it from there. Now, both of these methods are perfectly valid. Some are easier to control than the other. So the method that we're going to take in this video is to start with a single face and begin building out to create this geometry and bridging things together. Now, while this is a harder technique, and I say harder technique, it's a little bit harder for us to control and get some of the different areas correct. It's a little bit easier in the sense that it's more in line with traditional poly modeling. So a lot of polygon modelers, things like Blender, 3D Studio, Maya, and so on, a lot of people that use those programs will either create their geometry by creating a control frame of curves and sketches, and we've already explored creating sketches in 2D and projecting them or creating them in 3D. And another method is to simply create lofts or fill in the areas between those curves. That's not the method that we're going to take here. The other method that is typically common of poly modelers is to begin in one area and begin extruding out and building out the shape that you want. Now, this works a little bit easier in poly modeling programs because you're actually creating the mesh or the edges where you want that geometry. So for example, in this design, where we have this sort of tight transition, we would have an edge and we would control its edge weight, or we would add additional edges around it. When we look at this in box display mode, you can see the way in which we do this is by creating a tight section here. So what we're going to do is we're going to get started from scratch. We're just going to simply hide this body, and we're going to figure out how we can start to create this geometry. Once again, the intention here is not to completely create it, but just to learn some of the techniques. So let's get started by first creating a plane. I like to create planes because they're very easy for us to create them with parallel edges and keep them nice and symmetric. I'm going to draw this out to about the shape of the license plate. I am going to make sure that I have a mirror with length symmetry, and we're going to just use two divisions and say OK. With these two divisions, I actually want to double click this bottom edge and just hit delete and get rid of it. Now, it was just easier for me to keep those 2x2 divisions and delete a bottom edge. You could have certainly done a 1x2, but again, it's just easier this way for me. The next thing that I want to do is I want to take this bottom edge and simply use edit form and bring it up a little bit. Now, in this image that we have, which came directly from the BMW website, which you can see in the link in the description, what we have here is a license plate already. So we're going to just kind of use that license plate as the starting point. And before we go any further, let's go to a side view And let's box select everything and simply bring it forward on the car. From here, I'm going to go back to a front view. And what I'd like to do is I would like to get this edge to start to match the angle of this feature that's coming out. The main focus of this video, or potentially two videos depending on how long this goes, is for us to carry this geometry out and build out this sort of sharp section here. We're not going to be looking at all of the details of this little blend that comes up and the features down here, just because that is going to take quite a bit of time and quite a bit of technique. But I think with just some of the basics, you'll begin to understand how you can make this work. So we're going to start by selecting this edge, and I'm going to reset my pivot point to the top, and then I'm going to use rotate to begin rotating that out. Notice when I do that, it makes this bottom section lower. Then I'm going to use scale vertically until I get it about to the right point. This is also a great time for us to switch into box display mode, which you can do with Alt and 1 on the keyboard, or you can go into your selection options and select box display down here. Now that we have it in roughly the right position, I'm going to go ahead and bring it over a little bit. And in order to capture this detail here, I'm going to hold down Alt and I'm going to extrude this to the right. So this is going to give me an edge where I can begin to extrude down. It's also important to note at this stage, we have only created something that's completely flat. So I'm going to select those two edges and I want to bring this back slightly just to get a little bit of curvature. I'm going to view it from the top. And you can see here that we're starting to create a little bit of a twist. I'm going to grab this edge and I'm going to pull it back just so slightly. And we're going to go back to a front view. And now we've started to create a little bit of curvature. The bumper is starting to round out. In reality, the front of these is pretty flat, but it does tend to round out about here. The next thing that I want to note is in order for this to work, we really need this face or these faces to be divided in the middle. So the way that we're going to do that is by going to Modify and Insert Edge. I'm going to double click the bottom. I'm going to set my insert location to 0.5, and I want to go to a side view for this. When I go to a side view, note that we're using the simple insertion mode. Even though we took these edges and we pulled them back to give the bumper a little bit of curvature, we did nothing vertically to add any sort of curvature. So vertically, this is still essentially a plane. If I say OK with simple insertion mode, and I go back and forth between smooth and box display, you can see that it made no difference at all. It's still completely flat. Where box display helps us in this case is to just work on the divisions and work on the shape. When we start to add edges or insert edges when the shape becomes more complex, that's where we're going to really start to see a difference between things like exact and simple. But working in box display until you're happy with the shape is a good idea because things will begin to look pretty nasty in smooth display until we add our control. Now that we have this sort of basic takeoff point, I'm going to take this edge, I'm going to go back into Edit Form, and I'm going to hold down Alt and begin pulling this out. And I'm going to take it all the way up to this corner. Now the point here is to get this vertex in that corner because then I can use my set pivot, stick it here, and I can rotate this around until I'm happy with its position. And also note that we can just manually move things around. At this point, I realize that this edge right here needs to be a bit lower. Now, we don't have any control so far vertically. We still kept it fairly flat, but we can double click this and use Modify and Slide Edge to move it down. Note that Slide Edge ended up on this side. I'm going to just go ahead and move over until I'm happy with its location. You can see right here it's about at the right position, and I'll say OK. Now we've started to create this sort of wing shape, but we're far from done. We don't even have the position correct, and we really need to add a lot more edges or divisions in order to control the geometry. But with that selected, let's go ahead and pull this back. And generally, it's a good idea for you just to work pulling in a single direction. But in this case, I know that I'm going to have to modify the shape, so I'm not too worried about it. Note that this also happens to be inside of the bumper. If you're looking at images from the link in the description, you'll note that this feature actually rolls back into the bumper a little bit. And from there, it begins to come back forward. So from the front view, it looks pretty good, except for maybe we need to actually pull that edge down a little bit. So you can see that the shape is actually pretty far down. And if we bring our body back, we don't really have that captured yet. So another way that we can do this is to insert another edge. Now, inserting edges is a great way for us to add the control we need. And I'm going to insert it just on this face right here. And then we're going to say, okay. Remember, we're using simple insertion mode at this point still. When we view it from the side, it looks like it's still a pretty straight line. I'm going to take a quick look at smooth display, and you can see not really much is changing here because we haven't really started adding much curvature. But at this point, now that we have this edge, let's go ahead and double click the middle mouse wheel to bring it back. But now that we have this edge, we can begin positioning it where it goes. So once again, modify, edit form. I'm going to bring this edge up, and I want to bring this one down. I don't have a slide edge option here, so I'm going to go ahead and manually move it down, which likely will end up creating a little bit of a crease. Let's say okay, and let's just rotate this around and look. Another tip for you, when we have these canvases on and they're really big in this manner, what's going to happen is when we go to rotate, it's going to rotate about the middle of this. You can click the middle mouse wheel to reset that pivot point about an object or a vertex on your object. So that way we're not wildly rotating based on those images. But when we rotate this around, it still looks pretty good. This edge is pretty straight. And in smooth display mode, you can see that it pulls it back pretty far. But now that we have this division, this vertex needs to come forward. I'm going to go ahead and just bring it forward a little bit. And once again, double click the middle mouse wheel to fit the screen, and we'll go back to a front view. So now we're beginning to build out that corner. And at this point, what I really want you to understand is we're doing the very basic shape in box display right now. We're not taking a lot of time to try to add all the edges and details that we need. And if things are a little bit off, that's okay. But right now, what we're really focusing on is getting those big, broad surfaces, figuring out where they end up going, and then we can work from it from there. We can start to create the rest of the shape, and then we can add the control we need. At this point, before I go too much further, I'm going to go back to modify and insert edge, and I want to insert an edge here. I don't know that I really want it all the way in half. I'm going to bring it down a little bit to probably about 0.2, roughly in line with this division, and say okay. Then I want to go to modify, insert point, and connect the two. Now that we have those connected, once again, you can use that reset pivot point over here. Everything's still looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy so far. And once again, I haven't really added much curvature, so not much is really happening. It's still very planar, but that's okay because we can always move these things around later, but we really want to focus on that rough shape. The next thing that I want to do is potentially move that vertex up a bit more. Again, sometimes it's hard to see where that detail is, but you can kind of see this edge here. This is a fairly low-res photo that was on the website, and once you blow it up to the size of the car, then it tends to be a bit grainy, but it still gives us enough detail, enough information. What we're looking to do is create this sort of rectangular patch right here, and then we have this triangle section that comes out and comes down. So what we want to do is we want to be mindful of those locations, and once we're happy with it, I'm going to take just this edge, I'm going to hold down Alt and extrude this down. Once again, we're going to need to manipulate it. It's a good idea for us to use things like scale and move in a single direction. But in this case, what I want to do is I want to just position it based on that front view. And then from the side, I need to figure out where this actually is. In reality, this is pretty far back in the car. It's inside of the bumper. We're probably not going to see it from the side. But this is the shape that we're starting to define. Once again, the goal here is not to perfectly match this bumper. It's just to understand a little bit more about the layout and control we need to make these shapes. At this point, if we go into smooth display, it looks nothing like the bumper. And that's because in order for us to control these edges, we really need to have a lot more divisions here to make that happen. And this means extruding edges backwards, this means bringing geometry up, and it means inserting edges. Before we go ahead and try to add a bit more control, I'm going to take this edge and I'm going to extrude it down. And then I'm going to extrude it over this way. Again, we're not building everything here. We just want to look at the technique. When we view this from the side, all we've really done is we've made it pretty planar. So I'm going to start moving it back a little bit, noting that this geometry in the grill goes back and then it comes back forward. And once again, we're not exactly matching this, so just use your best judgment and play around with the shape. So now we've started to build this out and we've started to build this section out. We need to figure out exactly what level of control we need and how much further we want to take this. I'm going to double click this top edge and I want to extrude it up. I'm going to extrude it up, I'm going to view it from the side, and then I'm going to pull it backwards. And this is really just going to give me a little bit of curvature here. So that way I've got this nice roll here, and that'll really help us focus on the areas of detail or the areas of interest in this case. The next thing that I want to do is I want to take this front edge and I want to extrude it out, but I'm going to do this from the side. And I'm going to hold down Alt and pull it down just a little bit to create a tight edge. And then I'm going to hold Alt again and pull it back. Then let's go to the front view and let's take a look at this. I already know that this edge is too long and so is this edge. So I'm going to select both of them, reset my pivot point over here, say OK, maybe control and deselect that edge, which means we need to reset our pivot. Let's go ahead and put it back over here. And then we want to scale these down. Resetting the pivot point over here means it's going to scale from this point and not from the middle like it traditionally does. We want to pull this in away from this side, and then we're going to do the same thing here. And we can move it over manually, or we can use scale. Scale is usually a better option for us, but in this case, again, we're just trying to rough out the shape, so we really don't have to spend too much time on it. All right, so that looks pretty good. Let's hide the canvases for now, and let's just take a look at this. Looks pretty good so far. Let's go into smooth display real quick, and you can kind of see that we're starting to build out that shape. When we look at it in smooth display, you can see that we're getting that shape that we're seeing in the canvas, but it's not quite tight enough. We have a nice smooth transition on the front, but it's not tight enough here. Let's cancel, and let's bring back our canvas and go back into box display. So in order for us to get the tight transition, what we need to do is we need to insert some edges here to make that work. Now at this point, the side of this wing does tend to go back a little bit, but it's actually open. There's like a grill that happens here. One thing that we can do is we can build that grill area and then we can simply remove it later or flatten it or do whatever we need to. But if we need to add that detail that's not on the actual car, if we need to add that detail to help us control the geometry, it's a good idea for us to do that. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this edge, going to go to Modify, and I'm going to extrude it, holding Alt and simply pulling it up. When I pull it up, I want to go to a right-hand view before I deselect it. And note that we're going to be connecting to this. That's where we want that to be. So I'm going to pull it forward a little bit. And then I'm going to reset my pivot point. I'm going to stick it up there. And then I want to scale this vertically. Then we can scale it horizontally as well and use the scale to position it where we want it. Once I'm happy with that, I am going to say OK. I'm going to go back and weld these vertices together. I want to bring this one over here and say OK. Next, I'm going to take this edge and I want to extrude it back. So once again, Alt. This time I'm going to do it from the side view, holding down Alt and bring this back and up. Once again, I cannot stress enough that we are not trying to perfectly build this bumper in 3D. We are just looking at ways in which we can add this detail. So I'm just adding a bit more to the bumper here, so that way it helps us see it. I'm going to go into smooth display real quick, and obviously that does not have the control that we need. But if we're happy with the shape and we're happy with the location, now is the time that we can begin adding those additional edges. If we double click, you'll notice it grabs the entire thing. I can go into Modify, Insert Edge. I'm going to select both, and I'm going to, in this case, the insert location needs to be pretty small, so I'm going to change it to 0.05 and say OK. Now, when we do this, let's go back to smooth display. And now you can see that we've added a tighter transition, a tighter crease there. So we're starting to get that shape. If I hide the canvases, it might be a little bit easier. We're starting to get that tighter shape. You can see how it kind of blends away into this corner and it carries up over the top, but you can kind of see that shape that we're looking for. Now let's go ahead and go back into box display mode. The next thing that we would want to do is we would want to crease it here as well. But we haven't really finished off this area down here. So before I get into that, which will begin to influence the rest of this, I want to make sure the rest of my shape is going to be okay. So we're going to go to Modify and Edit Form. And now I want to bring some of this geometry back. And this is where it's going to get a little tricky because now we're going to have some competing edges to create that tangency. A couple ways that we can deal with this would be to first simply get rid of this edge and add it back after the fact, or we can try to extrude and match that distance or that offset. Extruding to match that offset is going to be much more difficult. So I think what I want to do is I want to get rid of that edge. But I don't have to do it just yet. I want to go ahead and extrude this back first. So from the side, holding down Alt, I'm simply going to drag this straight back. Then I'm going to use my vertical scale to sort of bring it down a little bit. And it looks pretty good. And I'm going to say OK. Next, I want to double click that entire edge and hit delete. When I delete the edge, you can see that everything else has been adjusted accordingly. Now, we would have lost that nice sharp crease that we had on the front. But again, this is why I say don't focus on that smooth display. We really want to focus on the box display until we've added enough control. So let's weld these vertices together. I'm going to bring this one over here. I'm going to say OK. Now if I double click on this edge, I can go ahead and insert a new edge. Notice that this one did not come included. And if I double click on that and I try to use insert edge, notice that it doesn't work. So what I need to do is I need to figure out exactly where I can insert those edges and whether or not I need both, in this case on either side, or if I just need a single. Now it's important to note that if we add both and we add one to this side, we really need to carry that edge up. If the geometry calls for that, if that crease is carried up into the rest of the car, then that's fine. But if it's not, it's simply going to be problematic for us. Let's go ahead and try it and see what happens. Also note that while I did pre-model or I did play around with this bumper before filming this, I am not following any script. I'm not looking at the old model that we created, this other body. And you can already see that there are some differences between the two. They're not in exactly the same position. But the intent here, again, is not to exactly match something. It's really for us to figure out a way in which we can create this geometry. Now, this gets a little bit tricky. And what I think I want to do is I'm going to select and delete these two edges here. Then I'm going to double click this edge and I'm going to go to Insert Edge and do the same thing, both 0.05. And then I want to use Insert Point to go from here to here and hit Enter. And then I need to carry this up. And this is going to be where it's a little bit tricky. I can take a couple of these upper edges and I can use Modify, Insert Edge. This time it's not going to be both, it's going to be single. 0.05 is still the location. And then I can use Insert Point and I can come from here. And here's where it gets really tricky for us because if we're manually selecting any geometry, then we're likely not going to exactly match that 0.05. But if we go from these edges that we inserted, we should get a pretty good result. The last thing that we need to take care of is this edge ending right here. And one thing that we could do is simply carry it over, but then you'll see that it's not an edge over here either. So we can either break it up sooner and carry it up, or we can do an offset on this edge as well. I'm going to deselect some of these. I only really want to offset this edge here. So let's go ahead and select it. Insert edge, making sure that it's going the correct direction. That looks pretty good. And then once again, we can go to Modify and Insert Point, and we can carry these over and hit Enter. So now is the time where we're going to go into smooth display mode and see what we've done. See if we've even hit the mark, if we're anywhere close. And you can see that we've been able to carry this edge up and it carries over and it's really nice over here. But a lot of stuff happens on this side of the design and it's not really what we're looking for. That's not really the right shape. But that doesn't mean that we're done and it doesn't mean that we failed. We still need to carry this edge over and make that a little bit tighter. So I'm going to go to Insert Edge. I'm only going to do a single insertion here. I'm going to say OK and go back to smooth display mode. So in smooth display, you can see that we were able to carry that geometry over how we would expect. So this shape is really good. That's exactly what we're looking for. We can probably add some additional control up here because we want to carry that over. but this transition, that sharp crease on the front, everything here looks really good, and I'm happy with those results. However, I am not really happy with this area. That's the area that we've got problems with. So again, let's go ahead and bring our edges back, go back into box display, and let's think about what we've done and what we can do. We still need to add some hard edges here, and then they kind of disappear in the center, and we're gonna have to blend them in somehow. So I'm gonna go ahead and select a couple edges, and I'm gonna add that control in. I'm gonna go to Modify, Insert Edge. Whether it's above or below, it doesn't matter, but in this case, I'm actually gonna go to negative 0.05 to put it above. And then I can do the same thing here. Again, Modify and Insert Edge. We're going to select this edge. Again, we want it to be on the top side, so we're going to get rid of that minus in this case. And you can see that it put it on the wrong side. So let's just do a Control Z, undo, insert edge, and let's leave minus 0.05. That puts it on the correct side. We're going to go to Insert Point, put those two together. And now we've tightened up the crease on that edge. However, this one right here is going to be problematic because we don't really want that tight crease to carry on. So the way that we deal with this is by moving edges around, and we'll come back to try to fix this in a little bit. So let's go ahead and look at this from the front. I'm going to take this edge and delete it. I'm going to delete this one as well. Then I'm going to insert edge one more time. This time we want it to be a little bit bigger than this. So we're going to go all the way up to minus 0.2, and then we'll use insert point to connect these at an angle. Notice that I connected it here, and then I can come back and delete this edge, and it'll automatically make that a single edge here, and we don't have to worry about welding any vertices. Now if we look in smooth display, the tighter crease starts to blend away. All right, so this is giving us a little bit better result. I'm happy with the way that's transitioning. We can do a little bit more work there, but so far it looks pretty good. And again, I don't have one of these cars, so I can really only get so much from looking at images, and the focus is really going to be in this area. But now we've sort of worked ourselves into a potential problem. So if we look at the canvas, this section here does not look right. We've got this weird transition here that we need to deal with. So there are a couple things that we need to do. We can add some additional controls here. So in this case, I'll go to Insert Edge. I'm going to do both. And probably 0.2 is a little bit extreme. I'm going to do 0.1, and then we'll look at it back in smooth display, and you can see that we've tightened up that curve. But now we need to figure out how we can control this section right here. We want a tighter transition inside of here. We really don't want this to be smooth and round, and the way that we do this is by adding some additional edges, unfortunately. So we're going to select this, modify, insert edge, and I'm going to leave this at 0.1, and I'm going to go ahead and do modify, insert edge. This one, you'll notice that it's giving me kind of a weird preview on the screen. It's got both. Let's do single. And if the last one was on both, then that's probably given us a bad result. You can see there's a tiny little edge there. So let's do Control Z, undo twice. Let's select a couple of these edges. I don't want to go all the way, but let's go ahead and select both of those. Insert edge, make sure that it's single. And it looks like it keeps trying to put it on the other side because of that negative value. Let's go ahead and use a positive value. Modify, insert edge, make sure that that's positive. Then we'll do the same thing down here. Modify, insert edge. It's on the wrong side, so I'm going to make this minus 0.1. And then we'll connect it with insert point. Let's take a quick look, and you can already see that we've tightened that corner up. One thing that you'll note is the final patches look like they're kind of in between where that curve should be. And if we hide the edges and we deselect, you can kind of see that this is probably not the best result. And the reason that this happens is because we've now added a lot of edges in very tight proximity, which means that the geometry is getting harder and harder for us to control. And when this happens, we end up in a situation where we start to have all these competing edges. And in order for us to smooth some of this geometry out, we need to start deleting it and sort of repatching it. So once we're happy with the rough position or the rough layout of everything, I think I'm going to go ahead and insert one more edge here. We'll say 0.1. You can see that, again, it just kind of has been putting it on the wrong side. So if that happens, we're going to make sure that this is a positive value. And then we can carry that up. So I want to take this one, insert edge. It looks like it's on the wrong side, so we'll add a minus, and that looks okay. So now we'll go to insert point. I'm going to do this from a front view because I want to get the straightest line possible. And then take a quick look in smooth display. In smooth display, I'm going to use Control or Command 4 to hide the edges and just take a look at this area. So this transition looks okay. This transition looks okay. Obviously, we're not perfectly trying to match the car, but we just wanted to tighten it up. But the areas that we still need to worry about is this crease here. Now, if the intention was to make that crease, that's perfectly fine. But if you don't want that crease, now is the time where we really need to work on getting rid of it. And the way that we get rid of it is we continue by doing some of these other tips that we understand. So if we want that crease to go away, then up here at this edge, what we really want to do is we want to start to widen it out. So I'm going to delete those edges. I'm going to delete this one as well. And I'm going to take this one up here. And actually, I'm going to select a few. I want to select these edges. I'm going to do an insert edge, and I'm going to set it a bit farther out at 0.25. And remember, the preview, the display is likely going to be in the wrong direction, so we're going to start with a positive value. Then I want to take this edge and delete it, and possibly these ones here. Then we're going to use Modify, Insert Point, and we'll connect those and allow it to sort of reconfigure those patches. Let's take a look at this in smooth display. Control or Command 4, and you can see that we've gotten rid of that crease. Now we've got a much more gradual transition. It's carried up the top, so this is something that we would likely want to work on or fix, but the front of it, we were able to get rid of that hard crease. And the reason it's carrying is simply because of the geometry that we're working with. At this stage in the process, I want to go ahead and use Repair Body and see if it can sort of pull out any of this geometry. And I also want to try to use Make Uniform. Sometimes when we're adding a bunch of new insert edges or points, sometimes it can actually go through and cause too much stress in the surfaces. So we might want to go through and sort of clean those up. It didn't really do anything for us here, but you can see that we're getting into a little bit better result. Now what I think I want to do is I want to move this edge over. So I'm going to select this upper edge, this little one here, and this one here. And I'm going to go to Insert Edge. It's on the wrong side, so I'm going to go minus 0.25. And that's way too far. That's way too far away. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to put it a little bit closer. So Insert Edge, minus maybe 0.1. Remember that this distance is the distance between it and the next edge. So half would be right here, 0.25 is there. 0.1 might still be a little too far away, but we'll go ahead and try it. All right, so you can see 0.1 worked okay, and we actually have this edge that we need to connect. So I'm going to delete this. I'm going to use Insert Point and connect these two together. So the process that we're using for adding edges and deleting them is the same process that you would use if you decided to start this entire thing as one big surface or one big form body, and we're adding or inserting new edges. Understanding edge control in that manner is, like I said, it's a little bit more difficult. So it wasn't the way that I wanted to approach this at first, but it's something I do want to cover, maybe with the same example. I'm going to take these two vertices and I want to bring them up and over. And you'll notice that it's really not giving me the result that I think I want. So I want to actually take these edges and I want to bring all of those edges over. At the bottom or at this corner, we can see this face, and I really want to carry that up all the way. We can reset the pivot down here, and we can use rotate to sort of bring them in line, and that looks pretty good. This looks pretty even and consistent. And the next thing I need to do is potentially scale them down because now they're really far up. So once again, I am going to select those edges, I can potentially change the orientation based on the space, set my pivot down here. And now when I scale, I'm going to be scaling along the length of that line. And I want to scale it until this looks good right here. Then I want to redo that. I want to select this edge. I'm going to reset the pivot and I want to scale this until that is almost horizontal. So it looks about like a straight line. I'm going to reset my coordinate space to world space. Take a look at this in smooth display. So that looks pretty good. One thing I'll say is that we could work a lot more on this edge, but that wasn't really the point of this content. I didn't really want to spend a bunch of time working on uh, a little edges and all these things. I really wanted to focus on this shape right here because getting a hard shape that then transitions into a smoother shape is one of the harder things that I've found in forms. It's very easy for us to make big, broad curves, but it's much harder for us to create these shapes where we've got these tight creases, these tight transitions, and they sort of work into smoother shapes. Again, we could spend a lot more time on, scaling things and moving things around, but I think the general shape or the general intent here hopefully makes sense. The way in which we added edges and removed edges. I think I want to get rid of this section down here. I didn't really like the way that that was looking. I'm going to go back to smooth display. And then likely what I would do is I would continue to work on this shape. These edges, I'm not really happy with these edges, but we're already 35, 36 minutes in. I don't think it's worth the time to continue to slightly work on and manipulate these areas. Hopefully this workflow makes sense. It's something that I think a lot more people can understand, especially if you have come from maybe a poly modeling background or have done some of this before. But starting with a single face and working your way out can be a little bit easier to try to figure out these complex shapes. I do want to say, and I do want to make sure that I express this and I urge this, is that don't worry about or don't be afraid to delete. So oftentimes it can be really tricky or it can be really hard for us to get into a situation where we spend a bunch of time working on something and we just don't want to delete it. We think that if we're going to delete it, we're going to ruin what we've done. But it's important that we understand that we can manipulate these shapes, we can tweak them, we can add edges, and at some point we're going to work ourselves into a situation where we've just created some bad geometry. And being able to identify that, being able to understand how we can maybe restructure our patches. Like you can see this is a four-sided face here, but it almost looks like a triangle. So understanding how we can maybe manipulate these and move things around to potentially get to a better result, I think is probably important or maybe even the most fundamental thing when trying to make complex shapes with form bodies. And also note that it does take a while. We can rough out a big shape relatively quickly, but to really work on all these details, these harder edges, these creases, it really takes a lot of time. And it's one of the reasons why I've kind of avoided trying to work on these details in videos is because this one shape here that we've been working on is almost 40 minutes now. And I kind of feel like people just don't want to see or watch all of those details. So if this content makes sense, if it helps and you would want to continue to watch something like this be fully modeled or fully progressed, then please let me know. Put it in the comments and say, this is valuable. I want to see this. Really, at some point, we're just repeating more of the same. So I really just don't know how helpful it is. And I don't want to spend the time to record hours and hours of videos trying to show this process when really you can pick it up after the first 15 or 20 minutes and then apply it to whatever you're doing. I do plan to try to record a video doing this bumper the other method where we create the big basic shape of the bumper and then we sort of manipulate it and move things around and get rid of shapes. It's going to be a little bit trickier to do, so I want to put this one out here first because I think people can follow it along a little bit better. And then once we figure out if there are any problems or comments or hangups with this, then we can go ahead and sort of work on that next step. What I would say from here, if you're going to continue to play around with this model, is spend some time adding and removing edges and potentially working on areas like this. So delete an edge, see what it looks like in smooth display. You might find that we just have added too much control, and it's very possible. Like, you can get into a situation where you've just added a little bit too much and it's more than you really need. So you can see that I was able to remove that edge, and I think that the result is quite a bit better. We might need to use things like repair body to fix that star point, and sometimes that can really help smooth things out. Or we can come back and we can add some additional controls in those areas. But again, I do strongly urge you to continue to play around with this, whether or not it's this bumper or you find another shape that you want to try to replicate. Then I strongly urge you to just play around and don't be afraid to make a couple different iterations. Like, you can see that this one here is different. Like, I just took a different approach. The patch layout is different. This one here looks, quite a bit different. If we move the entire thing and I just move it up so we can kind of see both at the same time, you can see that I took a different approach for both of these. And I didn't have a game plan. I just kind of wanted to make the shape. They look very similar. I mean, you can see that the shapes look very similar. But if we look at them in box display mode, you can even see that the number of divisions and the layouts that I have going up in this area and going up in this area, they just sort of progress differently. This edge here has more control than this one. I've got tighter edges inside of here, and they're a little bit more spaced out here, giving it a more gradual shape. But that's the important thing, is just continue to play around with it, refine it, and make sure that you understand that you can delete edges, you can delete faces if you want, and refill them back in. And a lot of times that is the best way forward. If you get into a situation where the shape here doesn't work, then if you come in and we just delete a few edges, it's going to automatically smooth it out. Then we can come back with insert point and we can figure out where we want that edge to be. And then we can allow it to sort of regenerate those. And in some cases, it will likely cross over. And if that's the case, then go back in, use insert edge. Maybe we put it at 0.5. Then we come back in with insert point now that we've got that reference. And now you can see that that's better than our first attempt. So don't be afraid to do that. Remember that you've got quite a few undos that you can do in order to get back. So play around, break some stuff, delete some edges, move some geometry around, see exactly how you can manipulate the shapes. And through that process, you'll be able to learn and you'll be able to hopefully apply it to just about any shape. And again, I can't stress enough that this process of making these sort of harder shapes inside of these softer shapes is the most difficult thing that I've personally come across in forms. It's very easy to make smooth shapes, it's very easy to make hard shapes, but making them together is very tricky, and it just take a lot of time. And there are still plenty of shapes that I struggle with every day. So play with it, work with it, make sure that you understand these basics of inserting edges, moving things around, scaling them, and so on, and hopefully that'll get you a little bit closer. Once again, please ask questions. Put it in the description if you think that you would follow along with this content if I continued. And if it's helpful at all, then please let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.